Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to Lateral Lawyers Live. We've just got a tiny little presentation this afternoon for you guys and girls out there. Just want to talk a little bit about entry into contractual arrangements for leasing. It's a really timely time to talk about this because we're getting a lot of interest from clients and prospective clients at the moment about how to go about entering into a lease. Now, first of all, there are different contractual documents that govern the entry into what is popularly considered to be a lease or a lease agreement. First of all, you have an agreement to lease. Now, an agreement to lease is essentially a document that is a more shorthand summary of the agreed rights and obligations between a landlord and a tenant to be, how do I put it, further documented and elaborated upon in a formal deed of lease. Now, the problem is sometimes agreements to lease will have a clause whereby a tenant has an unconditional or, must enter into the deed of lease without any recourse or right to negotiate further the terms of the lease arrangements. For example, there may be no conditions in the agreement to lease. So once you sign that agreement to lease, there's a little clause in the small print which says the parties will enter into the standard Auckland District Law Society, as the case may be, or it may be a bespoke agreement of the landlords and their lawyers if they're in the property game and do a lot of leases, without further recourse or a right to negotiate or amend any of the terms. Because of that, we are always vigilant and wary of agreements to lease that don't offer the right to a tenant or prospective tenant to either negotiate or amend further terms in the deed of lease, or at the very least to be able to actually negotiate the commercial terms offered under the agreement to lease. Another thing we have challenges with clients in terms of education and communication is getting them to understand the difference between a solicitor's approval or solicitor's check clause and a due diligence clause. So I'll just go through and explain what each of these clauses are, and then I think it will be patently obvious from that the marked difference in cause and effect for a prospective tenant. So a solicitor's approval clause historically is viewed, particularly in the conveyancing realm or area of law, but it also applies somewhat to leases or agreement to leases as well. Solicitor's approval clause is widely understood amongst lawyers to mean that it shall be limited to the legal aspects of the contemplated transaction. What I mean by that is if you bring me a lease and it says conditional upon solicitor approving the terms, clauses, rights and obligations of the parties, or in this case, the tenant under the lease, you're limited to us being, as your lawyer, being able to hang our hat on something reasonably cogent or on a principled way of looking at it, an actual legal matter or qualm that we, in good conscience, can raise on your behalf to say to the landlord or their representatives, their lawyers, for example, our client is not going to enter into this or go any further with these negotiations because of we have an issue with how this document's been drafted, or we believe that the expression of the calculation of OPEX is unclear or uncertain, or the make good obligations are not appropriate given the nature of the current fit out or arrangement at the premises. There's a whole host of things which arguably could come within that clause. However, the problem, and this is the real wrinkle here, the problem is that is open to challenge by a landlord who thinks they have their man, so to speak. They have their man or their woman in terms of their ideal tenant, and they don't think that the lawyer has the right to bring that up as a conventionally defined legal matter that they can say, you know, where my tenant client is no longer going to proceed with this deed of lease or this agreement to lease because we don't agree with the legal matters around this lease. Due diligence condition, by contrast, is conventionally understood to mean any matter concerned with entry into the agreement to lease documents. And that's not confined. It may well include the legal aspects of the documentation, but that is not confined necessarily so. So, for example, if your lawyer and your accountant or your life coach or whoever, whatever other Houdini-like character you have in your life says, look, this isn't a particularly good idea, the rent's too high, the foot traffic's too low, XYZ, the requirement for a personal guarantee in the current market is unfair, or at very least it should be capped, you don't, under a solicitor's approval clause, you may have a hard time actually being able to hang your hat on that as a viable reason that is taken without challenge by the landlord or the representatives to get out of the contract. Due diligence, by contrast, will allow you that unfettered or unconditional right to get out, hence why letting agents love solicitor's approval clauses, because they know that only in limited circumstances can a tenant actually get out without any fear of recourse from the landlord or potentially losing a deposit or a bond. And because it means that their job has somewhat been done. Due diligence, on the other hand, is far more open slather provision, which allows you a tenant to proceed with caution under proper legal and commercial advice. The other thing I wanted to touch on today, because I wanted to make this less than 10 minutes, is when you are going and looking at a lease premises, before you even get to the point where you have an agreement to lease and lease drafted, and this is going to make some of my landlord clients or people who are landlords or who are affiliated with landlords, families, or professionally happy when I say this. It's not all a one-way street. So what I mean by that is that if you are a landlord, you'll get plenty of tire kicker clients. You get tire kicker prospective tenants. A lot of them won't have the money to pay you, they won't have good security, and they may have a bad track record, or maybe they've just never leased premises before. So before you go and waste the letting agent or the agent or the landlord or their lawyer's time in terms of wanting agreement to leases and leases signed, which they'll have to pay for at the back end, have a really good think about what you want the premises for, and from the outside looking in, how many of those boxes do you think that the premises ticks for you? If you can find out who the landlord is by doing a little bit of Googling or research or asking around, that will give you some idea as to the extent of security requirements that this particular landlord may have. For example, Michael Friedlander, everybody around town knows Michael is hard but fair in general, and he has a pro forma lease with certain security requirements that I don't think are ever able to be negotiated. He has also a certain way of dealing with the whole COVID situation and rent abatement on a case-by-case basis. And so that is the sort of the Michael Friedlander shtick, so to speak. There are other well-known landlords around town who also have their particular quirks and ways of dealing with things. Again, a lot of these common people own a lot of the commercial property in Auckland. So by doing a little bit of digging or asking someone like myself, you can often find out who you're going to be dealing with and the best way forward given that extra information. Because after all, like any commercial negotiation or prospective transaction, it is often a case of limited information or information asymmetry, as my much more intelligent colleague Michael Merwin likes to put it. You're dealing with unequal amounts of information. The more information that you can gather on the party that you're dealing with and the subject matter of the prospective contract, in this case the lease or agreement to lease, the better equipped you are to go forward and actually make the right decisions, not piss people off, but also not get yourself into a situation where potentially you're obligated to go through with an agreement that about a subject matter which turns out to be drastically different from the contract you thought you were entering into, once someone like ourselves has a bit of a look under the bonnet to decipher the full extent of your rights and obligations. So thanks everybody for tuning in. I'm trying a new mic today. We've got all sorts of weird and wonderful technical creations going on at the Lateral headquarters. So I hope my voice is carried, and I hope I provided at least one of you out there with a little bit of value. Thanks very much. Good afternoon.